It is the smallest acts of kindness that sometimes rearrange a life entirely. Not the grand gestures, not the sweeping declarations, but the quiet ones. A tin of cookies left on a porch step, a knock on a door when the world has gone too silent, a return visit when no one asked you to come back. I learned this in the late summer of 1887, on a stretch of Wyoming land where the cottonwoods were still green, but the mornings already carried the first cool warning of autumn, and a man named Everett Kane had forgotten, somewhere between a horse's misstep and a shattered leg, how to let anyone in. I was 28 years old. I had been watching Everett from a careful distance for the better part of 3 years. The first time I brought him cookies, molasses, baked fresh that same morning because I'd seen him buy the same jar of molasses twice at Holt's General Store and put two things together, he answered the door on a crutch, his left shoulder bound tight with linen strips, his expression the kind that meant I am fine, even when everything else said otherwise. He looked at the tin, he looked at me. "Clara Finch," he said, like my name was a slow puzzle. "Everett Kane," I said back, handing them over. He took them with his good hand, and then, almost to himself, he said it. "I could get used to you." He meant it as a joke. I could hear it in the way his voice lifted at the end, dry as creek bed in August. But standing there on his porch with the smell of pine resin in the air and the mountains going pale behind him, it didn't feel like a joke to me at all. If stories about kindness, second chances, and old-fashioned love mean something to you, I'd love to have you here. Subscribe and join us for more heartfelt stories like this. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. Everett had ridden horses since before he could properly read. He managed 300 acres of grazing land east of town, alone, the way men of his generation were trained to manage things, quietly, stubbornly, and without complaint. The accident came in late August, on a morning so ordinary he probably never saw it coming. His horse spooked at a rattler on a dry ridge, twisted sideways, and came down wrong. Everett went with her. When the dust settled, he had a broken left leg, 2 cracked ribs, and a shoulder so badly torn he could not lift a bucket for weeks. Out here, in 1887, there was no hospital within a day's ride. A neighboring rancher found him an hour later, and the town's physician, a practical man named Dr. Aldous Prewitt, did what he could with what he had: splints, linen, rest, and time. Cowboys of that era understood that isolation was part of the bargain. Remote ranches could go weeks without contact in rough seasons. A man learned to fix fences alone, deliver calves alone, winter through alone. The land built a particular kind of self-reliance, and for some men like Everett, it built walls right alongside it. He was 54 years old. He had outlasted a drought, a cattle sickness, and 12 Wyoming winters. He did not know how to receive help gracefully. He barely knew how to ask for it. I began bringing things the second week after his accident when I heard through Mabel Durst at the feed store that Everett had not been seen in town. The first visit, cookies, the same molasses ones I'd left on his porch that first afternoon, baked before dawn so they'd still be warm by the time I rode over. The second, a pot of beef stew with the lid wrapped in cloth to keep the heat. The third, a tin of coffee grounds and a loaf of bread I'd baked the morning before, the crust still crackling when I set it on his porch rail. He never turned me away, but he never made it easy either. He would stand in the doorway, then, as the weeks passed, sit on the porch bench and accept what I brought with a nod that carried more weight than most men's speeches. We talked about small things: the weather, whether the creek had dropped, how the elk were moving. I came every 4 or 5 days, And then, without either of us deciding it, every 3. Why did I keep going? That was the question, I suppose. The one I didn't answer out loud. I had admired Everett Kane for reasons that had nothing to do with how he looked. 3 years before the accident, I had watched him spend the better part of an afternoon helping old Amos Pell rebuild a collapsed fence line after a storm. Without being asked, without mentioning it after. He simply showed up with tools and stayed until the work was done. I had seen him give a fair price for a struggling widow's hay when he could have offered less, and no one would have blamed him. I had watched him treat his horses with a patience that most men reserved for people they loved. These were not spectacular things, but they were real. And out here, on the frontier, where hardship revealed what a person was actually made of, real things were the only things worth counting. The relationships that lasted on the frontier, the ones built to survive bad winters and lean years, were not built on romance. They were built on reliability, on showing up, on being the kind of person who could be depended upon when the world turned difficult. Everett Kane was exactly that kind of person. I had known it for a long time. That October, a young man named Silas Brent took an interest in me. He was 32, newly arrived from Kansas, and by every reasonable measure, a fine prospect. He was kind-spoken, hard-working, and owned a modest but solid property on the north side of town. He asked me to accompany him to the harvest social, and I said I would think on it. The women at the quilting circle did not hesitate with their opinions. "A man your age and his makes sense," said Mabel Durst cheerfully. "Silas has his whole life ahead of him." "That Kane fellow," said another gently. "He's a good man, but Clara, you'd be nursing him before long." I smiled and kept stitching. What they didn't ask was what I wanted. What they didn't know was that Everett, somewhere across those weeks of porch visits and molasses cookies and quiet conversation, had begun to look at me differently, a little longer, a little more carefully. Did he realize what was happening? Did he understand that Silas Brent was asking to call on me? I wasn't certain, but I wondered if Everett believed he had already lost something he never knew he had. By November, Everett had graduated from the crutch to a cane, though he used it reluctantly. The shoulder was slower to mend. He began noticing things. When I arrived 2 days later than usual, a road had washed out. He was sitting on the porch already, watching the lane. He didn't say he'd been waiting, but the coffee was already on the fire inside. He started asking questions, not about the weather, about me, about what I planned to do come spring, about whether I'd taken Silas Brent up on anything. I answered plainly. I told him I hadn't decided. He went quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup in his good hand. He was not a man who planned for the future easily anymore. The accident had done something to that, made the horizon feel uncertain, the years ahead feel conditional. But slowly I could see him beginning to set small stakes in the ground again. A new timber order for the barn, seed catalogs coming in the post. One afternoon I arrived to find him sitting at the kitchen table with a pencil and a sheet of paper, sketching something. A new fence line, or maybe a cattle rotation. He folded it up quickly when I came in, but not before I'd seen the deliberateness of it. A man making plans again is a man who believes he has something to plan for. He was healing. Not just the leg, not just the shoulder. The hardest conversation came on a cold December afternoon. Snow still thin on the ground, but promising more. He looked at me across the porch railing and said very quietly, "You ought to give that Brent fellow a fair chance, Clara." I looked at him. "Why?" "He's your age. He's whole. He doesn't spend his mornings wondering if his leg'll hold. He paused. I'm not the kind of investment a woman your age ought to make. There it was. Not another man. Not the town's opinions. Just Everett Kane, 54 years old, sitting with his worn cane and his careful heart, convinced that time and injury had made him unworthy of consideration. I set down my coffee cup. Everett, I said, I've been watching you for 3 years. I've seen what you're made of. I'm not interested in whole. I'm interested in honest. He didn't answer right away, but he didn't look away either. It happened 2 weeks later. Simple. No ceremony. He met me at the gate rather than the porch, cane in hand, and he said, I'd like to court you properly, Clara, if you're willing. That was all. I'm willing, I said. He nodded once like a man who had just signed something important, and we walked back to the porch together. The town had opinions, of course. They always do. Some were warm. Dr. Prewitt shook Everett's hand and said he could think of no better outcome for his most stubborn patient. Amos Pell said to me privately that Everett Kane was the finest man he'd known in 40 years on the frontier. Others weren't sure. A few raised eyebrows at the age difference. A couple of the women at church suggested I was limiting myself. We thanked them, all of them, and went on choosing each other. By spring, Everett's leg had healed well enough for light ranch work. I helped where I could. More often than not, we worked the land together in the long afternoon light, the mountains still snow-capped behind us, the air carrying that particular western smell of sage and soil and something new beginning. We married in June, quietly, with a few friends and the minister from town. Domestic life with Everett was not glamorous. It was coffee at dawn and fence work by mid-morning and supper at a table we'd made ourselves. It was ordinary life, made beautiful by the company. Some mornings I brought cookies to the table and set them beside his cup, and he'd look at them, then at me, and there was that dry, almost smile again. I could get used to you, he'd say, and I would answer every time, you already have. What I want to leave you with is this. The people who love us most are often the ones who have been quietly showing up. Not dramatically, not with speeches, just there, with a tin of cookies and a willingness to come back. And sometimes the greatest obstacle to love isn't another person, or the world's opinions, or even time. It's the story we tell ourselves about whether we are still worth choosing. You are. No matter the age, no matter the season, no matter how many winters have made you careful. Healing begins the moment we allow someone to see us as we are, and choose to stay anyway. Thank you for reading. If this story found you at the right moment, I hope you'll carry some of it with you.